CGTN headquarters in Beijing. This is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and a very warm welcome to The Hub on CGTN. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Some milestones have no celebration, only mourning. And you never want to see them again in your life. The Russia-Ukraine conflict, now in its 6th month, is one of them. There's still no sign of peace, though casualties on both sides are mounting on a daily basis. The conflict has pushed the number of refugees worldwide past another staggering milestone, 100 million. What keeps this war going despite signs of attrition? How long can the global economy bear this crisis? And last but certainly not least, could the war lead to a nuclear disaster? Now, my guests today are Victor Olevich, lead expert at the Center for Actual Politics, joining me from Moscow, Russia. We also have Peter Zalmayev, director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative, joining us from Kyiv, Ukraine. And in our Beijing studio, we have senior fellow at Taihe Institute, independent political and economic affairs commentator, Einar Tangen. Gentlemen, welcome to the Hub on CGTN. Let me start with you, Peter. We've been talking about the situation in Ukraine for the past 6 months. Your reflections and thoughts on this very tragic milestone, 6 months on, and there's still no sign of letting up.
Well, indeed, both sides are sort of locked into this struggle to the death, despite the recent flurry of diplomatic activity, including by the Turkish President Erdogan and the Secretary General of the United Nations Guterres. Neither side is willing to compromise, and for both sides, it's the territorial issue. The Russian side is not willing to let go of the occupied territory of Kherson and Zaporizhia because it would mean that it has fought for absolutely nothing, and this could be potentially, very, very dangerous to the power of Vladimir Putin. On the other hand, Ukraine understands its lessons of 2014, that you cannot make compromise with this sort of enemy. That should Russia be able to freeze the current status quo, with the newly occupied territory, it will only use this to regroup and to continue further, because Vladimir Putin has not given up on its goal to control all of Ukraine. So here we are with the war showing no sign of ending soon.
Victor, in Moscow, Russia, how do you look at the situation?
Well, this conflict is going to be long and quite protracted because both sides have goals that have not been accomplished at this point. Russia's goals, ambitious goals that it set out at the beginning of the campaign, have not been achieved at this point. Russia has not been able to fully demilitarize Ukraine. In fact, Ukraine has been getting more and more massive military systems shipments from the United States and its European allies. Russia has not been very effective at this point in destroying those shipments once they enter Ukrainian territory. And the Ukrainian army has shown that it is able to resist for half a year right now, and it is not at this point showing signs of collapse. At the same time, Ukraine is also not willing to compromise on those goals, those wishes that Russia has set out. Kyiv is being egged on essentially by the Biden administration in Washington, by London and some other Western allies, to keep fighting at the expense of losing its own personnel and getting more damage, getting its economy in an even more damaged state. So essentially, this conflict is set for long term.
Right, talking about the war of words, Russia's President Vladimir Putin said the West and the U.S., quote-unquote, need conflicts to retain their hegemony and have destined the Ukrainian people to be used as cannon fodder. Einar, this is a war of attrition. Your reflections on the situation 6 months on?
Nothing has changed. I see it a little bit differently from my colleagues in Kyiv and Moscow, in the sense that this has always been about Russian security. What they need is buffer states between Russia and NATO. Even if they're members of NATO, that there be no, kind of eyeball-to-eyeball, missile-to-missile standoffs and things like this. It's still, in the end, it can only be solved. It's not about territory. It is about, because quite frankly, Russia is not in a position to hold the massive parts of Ukraine if the Ukrainian people resist. And quite frankly, the Ukrainians are not able to overcome the Russians in the field. So it's a standoff there. In the end, it will be only one way, and that is to assure Russia that it has security, to pull back these forces, have a complete peace treaty that talks about how these countries will not engage in putting missiles on each other's doorsteps.
Yeah, Peter, in Kyiv, Ukraine, any latest progress, on the diplomatic front at negotiating tables these days?
Unfortunately, we do not see that. I mean, we see like this brinksmanship on the part of the Turkish, like I said, the Turkish President Erdogan. Turkey is definitely going to squeeze out all the benefits it can from this conflict it already has. It enjoys a unique position of being close to both sides of the conflict, but right now the Ukrainian side communicated to Erdogan very clearly, we're not going to compromise at this point for as long as the enemy is controlling our territory. And just very quickly to refer to what the previous speaker said about security, well, it is about security. I mean, I think it is about Mr. Putin's paranoia if we're talking about security, and a very, very poor goal, from the beginning. It's truly a mistake of grandiose proportions. If we're talking about security, if Vladimir Putin was concerned with NATO expansion, he got it on his doorstep with Sweden and Finland about to join NATO. So he's gotten the opposite from what he, as our previous speaker said, set out to do. But I think it is actually very much territorial. Just like Mr. Brzezinski, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the former national security advisor of the United States president, said, Russia is not an empire without Ukraine. And the daughter of a famous Russian political scientist and the author of this idea of Eurasianism, Mr. Alexander Dugin, she was blown up in a car by some unidentified persons the other day. He actually was the one who's been propagating this idea of Eurasianism. And this is the idea that has finally gotten into the minds of the Russian leadership. And I think this is very much a war of empire.
Victor, do you want to respond? Do you agree?
Well, the daughter of Alexander Dugin, Daria Dugin, has been assassinated in Moscow by identified people. They had been identified yesterday during the investigation that's being conducted by Russian authorities. And the person has been identified as an agent of the SBU, of the Ukrainian Security Services. Now, as far as the peace agreement that my colleague in Beijing has spoken about, at this point, the West is interested in fully utilizing the crisis in Ukraine to cause maximum damage to Russian military forces in Ukraine and to the Russian economy. Essentially, the United States and its European allies are waging a full-scale economic war against Russia, and at the same time providing massive military support to the Ukrainian forces. And these weapon systems are used to kill, maim, and wound Russian soldiers and officers. What is happening in Ukraine is a conflict not just between Russia and Ukraine, but on a wider scale, it is a conflict between Moscow on the one side and Washington and its NATO partners on the other side. So Washington is not going to accept not using this opportunity to cause damage to the Russian economy and to the Russian army. So it is going to keep pushing weapons into Ukraine, and it is going to keep egging the Ukrainian leadership, the Ukrainian President Zelensky, and Ukraine's political military leadership to keep fighting. Washington is not interested at this point in a peaceful solution to this crisis in Ukraine on terms that would not amount to capitulation for Russia. And of course, capitulation is not something that is acceptable to Russia. So that is why one can only be quite pessimistic about reaching a peace agreement between Moscow and Kyiv in the near term, in the nearest weeks or months. It is very likely that this conflict will continue, and it may even escalate in the coming days and weeks, because for Russia,
Victor,
the current situation in the conflict is untenable.
Yeah, I think the Russians and the former people in the former Soviet Union knows a thing or two about not capitulating. Einar, is there some truth to what Victor had just said? I mean, in that Washington may not actually want a peaceful resolution anytime soon.
$45.5 billion says, mostly in military aid, says that is correct. If the U.S. had been serious about Ukraine, they would have tried to arm Ukraine when they were running around the world saying there is going to be a war. There was not one move to offer Ukraine anything. As soon as Ukrainian resistance materialized, then the U.S. saw it as an opportunity to weaken Russia. So at this juncture, it's very hard to escape any other conclusion except the U.S. is using this as a proxy war to undermine what it perceives as a direct threat, Russia.
Well, Peter, in Kyiv, Ukraine, to what extent do you think Washington has been complicating the situation, the war in Ukraine, for the worse?
Well, I would not go that far. I mean, it can only complicate, in my opinion, the war for the current war efforts is by slowing down the deliveries of weapons. The Ukrainian resistance has to be enabled to not only hold the line of the front lines, but to be able to stage successful counterattacks. And so by dragging this out, yes, there's a chance that this war will go into a protracted phase, and that's very dangerous. I agree with the speaker in the studio that there's a question to be asked why, if the U.S. knew that this was going to start as early as October, why didn't it start giving Ukraine so much weaponry, enough weaponry to serve as a deterrent force and to prevent Vladimir Putin from realizing his plan in the first place. But I am actually of the opinion that the only language Vladimir Putin understands is that of strength and of force, and so the U.S. should hurry and arm Ukraine sufficiently to do that. And as evidence of that, a group of former American diplomats, including ambassadors to Ukraine, has recently signed an open letter to the White House where they argue just that: do not be slow with weapons. Help Ukraine as much as you can and as fast as you can. That was the message of the letter.
But Victor, is provision of weapons adding fuel to the fire?
Of course, it's adding fuel to the fire, and that is exactly what Washington and its NATO allies want. They want this conflict to continue as long as possible, to cause maximum damage to Russian forces, to the Russian economy, and to Russian national security interests. Let's go back in time for a second to see how this conflict started, what provoked it. It was the United States and some of its NATO allies, such as Germany, the UK, and some other members of the European Union, that had supported the coup d'etat in 2014, in February 2014 in Kyiv, that had overthrown an elected president of Ukraine, Victor Yanukovych, and put in place a government that was more pro-Western, that was more that supported a much more closer military relationship with Washington and a closer military relationship with NATO, and wanted Ukraine to join NATO in the future. This was completely unacceptable to Moscow from its national security, from its own national security, from the standpoint of its own national security concerns. And from then on, starting from 2014 until now, for 8 years, Moscow has attempted to use various instruments of soft power, various pressure points to try and move Ukraine in a direction closer, move Ukraine away from NATO, and make sure that the Ukrainian leadership understands that joining NATO or moving closer to the West would be interpreted in Moscow as a direct national security threat. What did the United States and Britain do in those 8 years? They armed Ukraine. They provided significant training opportunities to Ukrainian forces. They moved a number of military instructors to Western Ukraine and some other parts of Ukraine, and planned on building military bases in Ukraine. Of course, Russia looked at those plans as a threat and was not willing to accept that outcome.
Peter,
That
isn't
was
there
one
some
of the
truth to what
reasons
Victor
that
had just said?
provoked this conflict.
Well, the interpretation of the events of 2014 I would take issue with. First of all, President Yanukovych ran away from Kyiv, and then Russia meddled in Ukraine's affairs after Yanukovych originally signed a special agreement with the European Union. So whatever Russia accuses the West of doing, it actually was doing itself, because it did not want to let Ukraine go. So the entire conflict, when we're arguing about territory, is it about territory? Is it about security? I think we can simplify. Russia cannot tolerate a different Ukraine, a Ukraine that is different from Russia, that is an un-Russia or an anti-Russia. Ukraine that has liberal democratic values is an existential danger to the Gulag state, the very repressive Gulag state that Vladimir Putin is building for Russia, and therefore he sees all these former Soviet satellites, which are not in its orbits, as an existential threat.
Well, Victor, do you want to quickly respond? A Gulag state, quote unquote?
Well, first of all, when Peter Zalmayev talks about the Ukrainian President Yanukovych running away from Kyiv, that is a misrepresentation, to put it mildly. There was a coup d'etat that replaced a lawful president of Ukraine, whose election was recognized not only by Russia but by Western states as well. And it was because of that coup d'etat and because of a direct threat to Yanukovych's life that he was forced to leave Kyiv and then to leave Ukraine. It was not on his own terms. And the United States and its NATO allies supported that coup d'etat and supported the interim president of Ukraine, Alexander Turchinov, who replaced Yanukovych for several months, even though Turchinov was not even elected by anyone. So that was a pro-Western coup d'etat supported by the West. And the purpose was to hurt and to put pressure on Russia's interests and influence, to curb Russia's influence in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. Now, as far as Mr. Zalmayev's characterizations of Russia as a Gulag state, we have to only look at Ukraine and see how many people have been thrown in jail and in prison for sympathies to Russia. We have to look at how many political leaders in Ukraine, such as Viktor Medvedchuk and some others, have been arrested on so-called treason charges. We have to see how Ukrainian President Zelensky has used his wartime authorities in the last half year to curb Ukrainians' political freedoms, and how he has used those authorities, his authority to curb political activity of his competitors and opponents within Ukraine's political field. That's very well known in Kyiv, and it's very well known among Ukraine's neighbors.
All right, gentlemen, there are different narratives out there. Thank you for articulating them for our audience. It's very important to hear from both sides. Einar, let's talk about the global economy. It is struggling according to many projections. For example, the one put forth by the IMF, expecting the global economy the growth rate to decrease by half, in a large part due to the war in Ukraine. And also some estimates say that Ukraine's GDP may fall by 30 to 40%. Where is all this going?
In no direction that's good. Unfortunately, Ukraine is not an isolated incident. It is one that is creating a viral contagion around the world. There's shortages of energy, which is necessary to run economies, and food, which is necessary to sustain human life. The increases, the inflation, these are going to roil all of these democracies out there. Democracies tend to be very focused on their pockets. If they do not have enough to eat or they cannot heat their home, they're going to vote for the other side, hoping that they can come through with promises that generally will not be kept. So at this juncture, we're entering a very, very difficult period. You're going to see more insurrections. You're going to see more votes casting, governments out. And unfortunately, it's not going to solve the problem because underlying, it's issues like this.
Yeah, because Western European countries bought almost half of Russia's oil and natural gas exports, right? And there's this prime ministership up for grab in the UK.
Well, up for grab, it's an inter-party squabble where each one seems to be vying to show that they're more conservative. They're not necessarily in step with the British people, but this is one of those peculiar parts of different democracies. This one is about who's going to be the leader of Great Britain, but they will not be elected.
What about the midterm elections in the United States? The Democrats, the odds of them are not looking so good, even after Pelosi's very controversial visit to Asia. How will the war in Ukraine impact the election process, the midterm elections in the U.S.?
It could actually backfire on the Biden administration. People are saying, look, I don't have enough baby formula, I don't have milk, gas is high, although it has come down. Generally, within these midterm elections, economics is the number one. They look to see whether the president and Congress have been able to settle their problems and do something for the people. That has not happened. On the other side, though, you now have forces galvanizing around political issues such as abortion, guns, Donald Trump, election lies, etc. So it's going to be a battle not about positives, but once again about who is more negative.
Wow, unfortunately, we've seen that repeatedly throughout history. Peter, let me turn to you. The projection is truly dire. Ukraine's GDP may fall by 35 to 40% in the remaining 4 months of 2022. What will all this mean to the life of everyday Ukrainians?
It's going to be a very tough, winter coming, not just for Ukraine, but as we know, for all of Europe, for Russia, for all of us. Obviously, this responsibility for this suffering lies with the person who started this war. This is a war of choice by one person, Mr. Putin. Then you can argue if the rest of the Russian population has been its enablers, but that's another question. Having said that, yes, Ukraine specifically is going to suffer tremendous an economic setback. There's a little bit of a valve that's helped Ukraine, and the 6 million plus Ukrainians who have been kindly hosted by European, Western, and other nations. That's been able to help a little, and the IMF injections have helped. The U.S. has been a steady ally, and the Ukrainians know that what they're in for, which you cannot say about the Russians. Ukrainians are fighting for their country, and they're going to be willing to weather this storm, I'm sure. The Russians, are not being told what the war is being waged for. In fact, there is a criminal liability if you call this even a war. It's a special operation. So when you hear our speaker from Moscow say whatever, you have to understand that he is acting under duress, essentially. Whatever he says will be and can be used against him, including this 15-year prison term for saying things that damage the reputation of the Russian army. That is the reality in which the Russian people are living. Ukrainians, as bad as it is with the economy, they know they're fighting for their freedom and for their sovereignty.
Victor, how is the Russian economy holding up after rounds of Western sanctions?
Well, first of all, the Russian economy is holding up much better than predicted by many Western analysts. Of course, the conflict in Ukraine and the massive economic sanctions that have been levied against Russia by the United States, its European allies, and even some other countries, such as South Korea, have had an effect on the Russian economy, have had an adverse effect, but Russia has been able to keep its economy intact, and it has enough resources to do so for a long time. Now, as far as what Peter Zalmayev said about freedoms or the lack of them in Russia, again, looking at Ukraine, Ukrainian officials, Ukrainian representatives of authorities in Nikolaev region, for example, in Ukraine, have officially announced in the past week that they had gone essentially door to door in Nikolaev to meet with every resident of the city to make sure that they have no sympathies for Russia, to root out people who are sympathetic to Russia. We have seen thousands of people thrown in prisons and jails in Ukraine for showing or expressing sympathies for Russia or Russian forces. So when one talks about freedoms of expression or other rights, human rights, it is not just an issue in Russia, it is equally an issue, or even more so, an issue in Ukraine. And that is something that is not frequently being talked about in the West, because Ukraine is an ally of the West. Now, as far as what my colleague in Beijing said about Europe's and America's economic woes and electoral prospects, it is true that several governments in Europe, the British government, the Italian government, have been replaced, and economic issues have played a part in that, some part in that. But one must say that irrespective of how the midterm elections in the United States play out, even if the Republicans take the House of Representatives, which is quite likely, even if there are more changes in European governments in the coming months, it is very unlikely that that will cause a cessation of military aid, a cessation of economic aid to Ukraine from the United States, from the United Kingdom, and some of their other allies, because there is an overarching strategic decision there in the West to use Ukraine to cause maximum damage to Russia. And that strategic tenet, essentially, is going to be supported by any government that comes to power in the United Kingdom and by both Democrats and Republicans in the United States.
Right. Einar, any final thoughts? We'll have about 40 seconds left.
This is in a nutshell. You've heard my colleagues from both sides. Unfortunately, this is exactly why there's no progress in terms of peace. You have to recognize that the issue is what it is. It is about Russia's security. The U.S., you can say what you want about Russia. The U.S. did this with the Cuban Missile Crisis. They've used it as an excuse many times over, and now in the Asia-Pacific region. So at this juncture, I'm hoping that statesmen will arise from the chaos and that they will realize that war is not going to have any positive effects. The deaths of innocent civilians, whether they're Russian or Ukrainian, is not going to change the underlying issues and the concerns that are going to have to addressed in order for there to be peace.
Hopefully peace will come sooner rather than later. Einar Tangen, thanks so much. Also, Victor Olevich and Peter Zalmayev, thank you all so very much. And that will do it for this edition of The Hub on CGTN. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Our news coverage continues on CGTN. Bye and take care.